October 13th, 1903. Millbrook Junction, Pennsylvania, 7:47 p.m. Temperature 34 PAV. Heavy fog. The autumn fog rolled across the Pennsylvania countryside like a burial shroud, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the amber glow of gas lamps that dotted Millbrook Junction's modest platform. The temperature had plummeted throughout the day, and now an unnatural chill seemed to seep into the very bones of anyone foolish enough to venture outside. Station Master Cornelius Hatch pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders as he checked his pocket watch for the dozenth time that evening. The Midnight Express was running late. Again. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the fog carried whispers that made his weathered hands tremble as he adjusted the signal lanterns. In his 37 years of service to the Pennsylvania and Western Railroad, Hatch had never experienced such an oppressive atmosphere. The air itself seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as if something ancient and hungry had awakened in the mist. Through the swirling gray veil, the distant wail of a steam whistle cut through the silence like a banshee's cry. The Midnight Express was finally approaching, its massive iron form emerging from the fog like a specter returning from the grave. The locomotive's headlamp pierced the darkness, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed across the platform. Engine 47, a magnificent Pennsylvania Class K2 Pacific, hissed and groaned as it pulled into the station. Steam billowed from its cylinders, mixing with the fog to create an almost supernatural tableau. The engineer, a grizzled veteran named Ezekiel Stone, leaned out of the cab window, his face pale and drawn. Something was wrong. Hatch could see it in the man's eyes, a fear that went deeper than concern about schedules or weather conditions. "Evening, Zeke?" Hatch called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "You are running mighty late tonight." Stone's response was barely audible above the engine's labored breathing. "Track troubles up north. Had to take the old route through Raven's Hollow." He paused, glancing nervously at the fog-shrouded woods beyond the platform. "Strange things in those woods tonight, Cornelius." Strange things indeed. Behind the locomotive, 6 passenger cars stretched into the mist like a serpent's body. The windows glowed with warm yellow light, revealing silhouettes of the 43 souls aboard. Men, women, and children, who had no idea they were about to become part of the most enduring mystery in American railroad history. Among those passengers was Minerva Blackthorne, a renowned psychiatrist from Philadelphia, who had spent the last decade studying the human mind's darkest corners. At 38, she possessed an intellect as sharp as a surgeon's blade, and intuition that had helped solve several cases the police had deemed hopeless. Her striking auburn hair was pinned back in the fashionable Gibson girl style, and her emerald eyes held a depth that made people uncomfortable, as if she could peer directly into their souls. Blackthorne had boarded the train in Pittsburgh, bound for a conference in Chicago, where she planned to present her groundbreaking research on collective hysteria and mass psychosis. The leather satchel beside her contained notes that would revolutionize the field of psychology if she ever reached her destination. Sitting across the aisle was Tobias Grimm, the traveling salesman whose jovial exterior masked a troubled past. At 45, Grimm had spent the better part of 2 decades peddling patent medicines and mechanical curiosities across the eastern seaboard. His sample cases, secured in the baggage car, contained more than just merchandise. Hidden among the bottles and gadgets were documents that could destroy several prominent families in Pittsburgh's elite circle. Grimm's weathered hands shook slightly as he poured himself a drink from his silver flask. The fog outside seemed to be pressing against the windows, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from within that gray void. He had made many enemies during his years of blackmail disguised as business, but tonight's unease felt different, primal, and inescapable. 3 rows behind him sat the Ashford family, Judge Horatio Ashford, his wife Constance, and their 7-year-old daughter Violet. The judge was returning from a controversial trial in Philadelphia, where he had sentenced a man named Jonas Crane to death for a series of brutal murders. The condemned man's final words still echoed in Ashford's mind. "You and all your kind will know true darkness before the moon turns again." Little Violet pressed her face against the cold window glass, her breath fogging the surface as she traced patterns with her small finger. Something moved in the fog outside, a shadow that seemed to shift independently of the swirling mist. The child's eyes widened with a mixture of curiosity and fear, as the shadow appeared to take the shape of a man, tall and thin, beckoning to her from the darkness. "Mama," she whispered, tugging at her mother's silk sleeve. "There's a man outside." Constance Ashford glanced toward the window, but saw only the impenetrable fog. "It's just your imagination, dear. Try to get some rest." But Violet knew what she had seen. The shadow man was real, and he was following the train. In the forward car, elderly Professor Marcus Thornfield adjusted his spectacles and returned to his leather-bound journal. The retired archaeologist had spent the last 6 months investigating reports of strange artifacts being unearthed near Millbrook Junction. His research suggested that the area had once been sacred to the local Native American tribes, a place where the veil between worlds grew thin during certain celestial alignment. Tonight was the new moon, and according to Thornfield's calculations, the cosmic conditions were perfect for what the ancient texts described as the thinning of barriers. He had dismissed such notions as superstition, until his recent discoveries in the old mining tunnels beneath Raven's Hollow. The symbols carved into those underground walls told a story that challenged everything he thought he knew about the region's history. The train's whistle shrieked again as Engine 447 began to pull away from Millbrook Junction. Station Master Hatch watched the red taillights disappear into the fog, and a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the October air. He had an overwhelming urge to run after the train, to warn the passengers of some unnamed danger, but his feet remained rooted to the platform. As the sound of the locomotive faded into the distance, an unnatural silence settled over the station. Even the usual night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, seemed to have been swallowed by the fog. Hatch stood alone on the empty platform, surrounded by a darkness so complete it felt alive. He would be the last person to see the Midnight Express. Aboard the train, Dr. Blackthorne found herself unable to concentrate on her research note. The fog outside had grown so thick that it completely obscured the landscape, creating the unsettling sensation that they were traveling through nothingness. The car's oil lamps flickered sporadically, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move with malevolent purpose. The other passengers appeared equally unsettled. Conversations had dwindled to nervous whispers, and even the children seemed subdued. Little Violet Ashford continued to stare out the window, her small face pressed against the glass, as if searching for something in the impenetrable gray void. Conductor Benjamin Hayes made his way through the cars, checking tickets and trying to maintain an air of normalcy despite his own growing unease. Hayes had worked the railroad for 23 years, and he had never experienced weather quite like this. The fog seemed to be following them, maintaining the same density regardless of their speed or direction. "Excuse me, conductor," Dr. Blackthorne called out as Hayes passed her seat. "How much longer until we reach the next station?" Hayes consulted his pocket watch and frowned. "Should be approaching Willow Creek in about 40 minutes, ma'am. Though with this fog it's hard to tell our exact position." What Hayes didn't mention was that they had passed several mile markers that didn't match their expected route. According to his calculations, they should have been traveling northeast toward Willow Creek, but the compass in his pocket suggested they were heading due north, directly into the heart of the unexplored wilderness that locals called the Devil's Triangle. As the train rounded a curve, Engineer Stone leaned on the whistle cord, sending another mournful wail into the night. The sound seemed to be absorbed by the fog almost immediately, as if the mist itself were alive and hungry for their presence. Stone's fireman, a young man named Caleb Murphy, shoveled coal into the firebox with increasing urgency. "Something ain't right, Mr. Stone," Murphy called out over the engine's roar. "The steam pressure keeps dropping, but I'm feeding her all the coal she can take." Stone nodded grimly. He had noticed the same thing, along with several other mechanical anomalies that defied explanation. The locomotive's behavior reminded him of stories he'd heard from older engineers, tales of trains that had ventured into cursed territories and never returned the same. The fog outside began to take on an almost luminescent quality, as if lit from within by some otherworldly source. Strange shapes moved within the swirling mist, forms that resembled twisted trees one moment, and reaching human hands the next. Stone rubbed his eyes, telling himself it was just fatigue and imagination, but the shapes persisted. In the passenger compartments, The temperature began to drop noticeably. Breath became visible in small puffs of vapor, and passengers pulled their coats and shawls tighter around their shoulders. The oil lamps flickered more frequently now, their flames dancing as if struggling against some invisible force trying to extinguish them. Judge Ashford checked his gold pocket watch and frowned. They had been traveling for over an hour since leaving Millbrook Junction, yet they should have reached Willow Creek by now. The fog made it impossible to judge their progress by landmarks, but something felt fundamentally wrong about their journey. Conductor Ashford called out as Hayes passed through their car again. "Are we on schedule? My watch shows we should have reached the next station by now." Hayes paused, his face betraying a moment of uncertainty before he composed himself. "The fog has forced us to reduce speed for safety, sir. We should reach Willow Creek shortly." But privately, Hayes was beginning to suspect they were no longer on the main line at all. The track beneath them felt different, older, less maintained, and there was something else. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The train's movement had taken on an almost hypnotic quality, as if they were being drawn forward by forces beyond the locomotive's steam engine. Professor Thornfield looked up from his journal, as a chill wind seemed to pass through the sealed passenger car. His scholarly mind searched for rational explanations, but the archaeological evidence he had uncovered suggested that rational explanations might not apply in this particular region. The Native American legend spoke of a place where the spirit world intersected with the physical realm, a crossing point that became active during certain astronomical conditions. The symbols he had discovered in the underground chambers depicted a recurring theme: trains of iron horses carrying the souls of the living into the realm of shadow. At the time he had dismissed these carvings as metaphorical, but now, surrounded by this supernatural fog and feeling the train's inexplicable behavior, he began to wonder if the ancient warnings had been more literal than he had imagined. Blackthorne noticed that several passengers had fallen into an unusually deep sleep. Despite the car's growing cold, their breathing was shallow and rhythmic, and their faces had taken on a peculiar pallor. As a medical professional, she recognized the symptoms of hypothermia, but the temperature, while cold, wasn't severe enough to cause such dramatic effects. She rose from her seat and approached the nearest sleeping passenger, an elderly woman traveling alone. Dr. Blackthorne gently shook the woman's shoulder, but there was no response. The woman's pulse was weak but steady, and her skin felt abnormally cold to the touch. It was as if she were entering some form of hibernation. "Ma'am?" Dr. Blackthorne called out softly. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes opened slowly, but they seemed to look through Dr. Blackthorne rather than at her. For a moment the elderly passenger's lips moved as if she were trying to speak, but only a whispered phrase emerged. "They are waiting, in the hollow, waiting for us all." Then her eyes closed again, and she returned to that deep, unnatural sleep. Dr. Blackthorne felt her medical training warring with a growing sense of supernatural dread. Everything about this journey defied logical explanation, from the persistent fog, to the train's mechanical anomalies, to the passenger's mysterious condition. She made her way toward the front of the car, determined to speak with the conductor about stopping the train. As she moved down the aisle, little Violet Ashford suddenly grabbed her arm with surprising strength. The child's eyes were wide with terror, and her small hand felt ice cold, despite her heavy winter coat. "The Shadow Man," Violet whispered urgently. "He's inside now. He's walking through the cars and he's looking for someone special." Dr. Blackthorne knelt down to the child's level, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. "What Shadow Man, sweetheart? Can you describe him?" "Tall and thin, with eyes like empty holes. He wears a conductor's uniform, but it's all torn and dirty. And his face," Violet shuddered, "his face looks like it's been sleeping in the ground for a very long time." Before Dr. Blackthorne could respond, the lights in their car went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. The only sound was the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails and the distant whistle of the locomotive. Then, from somewhere in the darkness ahead, came the sound of a door opening, the distinctive creak of a passenger car door being slowly pushed ajar. Footsteps echoed through the car, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to pause at each row of seats. The passengers who were still awake held their breath, straining to see through the impenetrable blackness. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a sound that made Blackthorne's blood run cold, the soft whisper of someone or something breathing directly behind each seat as it passed. Judge Ashford fumbled for his matches, striking one with trembling hands.
The brief flare of light revealed a figure standing in the aisle just 3 rows ahead, a tall, gaunt man wearing a railroad conductor's uniform that appeared to be decades old and stained with what looked like grave dirt. The figure's face was partially obscured by shadow, but what they could see made several passengers gasp in horror. The match burned out, returning them to darkness. The footsteps resumed, moving steadily toward the back of the car. Dr. Blackthorne pulled little Violet close, feeling the child's small body trembling with fear. Around them, the few conscious passengers pressed themselves against their seats, hoping to avoid the attention of whatever was walking among them. The train's whistle sounded again, but this time the sound was different, lower, more mournful, as if the locomotive itself were crying out in despair. The fog outside had taken on an almost solid appearance, pressing against the windows like grasping fingers trying to claw their way inside. Suddenly the mysterious footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, a voice spoke from the darkness, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now approaching our final destination. Please remain in your seats and prepare for arrival. Those who have been chosen will disembark first. The others have a different journey ahead of them. The voice was followed by a sound that would haunt the nightmares of anyone who survived to remember it. Laughter that echoed from the walls themselves, growing louder and more maniacal, until it seemed to fill not just the passenger car but the entire world around them. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The laughter, the footsteps, even the sound of the train itself fell silent. In that moment of absolute quiet, Blackthorne realized something that filled her with a terror beyond anything she had ever experienced in her psychiatric practice. The train was no longer moving. They were stopped somewhere in the fog-shrouded wilderness, surrounded by a darkness so complete it seemed to have substance. And according to little Violet's whispered observations, they were no longer alone on the train. Something had joined them during their journey through the mist, something that had been waiting in the hollow places of the world for just such an opportunity. The Midnight Express had become a trap, and they were all caught inside it, suspended between the world of the living and something far more sinister. As Dr. Blackthorne sat in the absolute darkness, holding a terrified child and listening to the shallow breathing of passengers who seemed to be slipping away from consciousness one by one, she realized that their ordeal was just beginning. The train that had left Millbrook Junction on that fog-shrouded October night in 1903 was about to become something else entirely, a vessel for horrors that the human mind was never meant to comprehend. And somewhere in the darkness around them, the Shadow Man was still walking through the cars, still searching for whatever he had come to collect. The fog pressed closer against the windows, and in its swirling depths, Blackthorne could swear she saw faces, dozens of them, all staring at the motionless train with expressions of hunger and anticipation. They had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the Midnight Express to finally arrive at its true destination. But where exactly were they? And more importantly, would any of them live to see the dawn? The answers to those questions lay somewhere ahead in the darkness, waiting to be discovered by those brave or foolish enough to step off the train and into the fog-shrouded mystery that had swallowed them whole. Minerva Blackthorne's hands trembled as she fumbled through her medical bag in the absolute darkness. The silence that had fallen over the train was more terrifying than any scream could have been. Around her, she could hear the shallow, synchronized breathing of passengers who seemed to be slipping deeper into that unnatural sleep with each passing moment. "Violet," she whispered to the child pressed against her side, "are you still awake, sweetheart?" The little girl's response was barely audible. "Yes, but I'm so cold, and I can see him moving between the seats, even in the dark. He's checking each person, like he's looking for something." Doc Blackthorne's medical training told her this was impossible. Human eyes couldn't see in complete darkness, but her instincts, honed by years of studying the inexplicable depths of the human psyche, suggested that little Violet might be perceiving something beyond the realm of normal vision. A match flared to life 3 rows ahead as Judge Ashford attempted to illuminate their surroundings once again. The brief orange glow revealed a scene that would be burned into Dr. Blackthorne's memory forever. The shadow figure was indeed moving through the car, but now she could see that he wasn't alone. Behind him walked a procession of translucent forms, men, women, and children dressed in clothing from various eras,
all bearing the unmistakable pallor of death. The ghostly procession moved with purpose, each spectral figure pausing beside specific passengers. As Dr. Blackthorne watched in horror, she saw one of the apparitions, a woman in a Victorian dress, lean down and whisper something into the ear of the elderly passenger she had tried to wake earlier. The living woman's breathing became even more shallow, and her skin took on an almost bluish tint. The match burned out, but the image remained seared in Dr. Blackthorne's mind. These weren't just random spirits. They were collecting something from the passengers, drawing away their life force like vampires feeding on blood. Suddenly the train lurched forward with a grinding screech of metal on metal, but the movement felt wrong, as if they were being pulled rather than driven by the locomotive's steam engine. Through the fog-covered windows, Blackthorne caught glimpses of impossible shapes in the mist, towering structures that defied architectural logic, twisted trees that moved with deliberate malice, and what appeared to be a massive stone archway that the train was approaching. In the locomotive cab, Engineer Stone found himself no longer in control of his machine. The throttle moved by itself, opening and closing according to some otherworldly intelligence. His fireman Caleb Murphy had collapsed hours ago, or was it minutes? Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this fog-shrouded nightmare. "We are not on any track, I know," Stone muttered to himself, watching as spectral hands appeared to guide the locomotive through the mist. The compass spun wildly, and the steam pressure gauges showed readings that should have been impossible with their current fuel consumption. Behind him, Conductor Hayes made his way through the passenger cars, but his familiar uniform now hung in tatters, and his face bore the same deathly pallor as the ghostly procession. Whatever force had taken control of the train had also begun to claim its crew, transforming them into servants of some ancient and malevolent power. Dr. Blackthorne realized with growing horror that Hayes was no longer entirely human when he stopped beside her seat. His eyes had become hollow voids, and when he spoke, his voice carried the echo of distant tombs. "Dr. Blackthorne," he said, his words seeming to come from far away, "you have been chosen to witness what lies beyond the veil. Your studies of the human mind have prepared you for truths that others cannot comprehend." "What do you want?" she demanded, pulling Violet closer. "What's happening to these people?" Hayes tilted his head with an unnatural motion, like a marionette controlled by inexpert hands. "The crossing has begun. For over a century, the spirits trapped in Raven's Hollow have waited for the proper alignment of celestial forces. Tonight the barriers between worlds grow thin, and the dead can finally reclaim what was taken from them." As if summoned by his words, Professor Thornfield's voice called out from the darkness. The elderly archaeologist had apparently remained conscious, and his scholarly mind was desperately trying to process what he was experiencing. "The mining operations," Thornfield said, his voice shaking with realization.
In the 1840s, they disturbed something beneath Raven's Hollow. The Native American warnings. They were trying to tell us that certain places should remain untouched. Hayes turned toward the professor with that same unnatural movement. "Marcus Thornfield, your research has uncovered fragments of the truth, but you lack the understanding to see the complete picture. The Hollow was never a burial ground. It was a gateway. And tonight, that gateway has finally opened wide enough for us to bring the living across to our realm." Dr. Blackthorne's mind raced as she tried to piece together the supernatural puzzle surrounding them. As a psychiatrist, she had studied numerous cases of mass hysteria and collective delusion, but this was something far beyond the scope of mental illness. The evidence of her senses, the impossible cold, the ghostly figures, the train's unnatural behavior, all pointed to a reality that her scientific training told her couldn't exist. But existence, she was learning, was far more complex than medical textbooks suggested. The train continued its impossible journey through the fog, and gradually, structures began to emerge from the mist on either side of the tracks. They appeared to be buildings, but their architecture belonged to no earthly civilization. Spires twisted upward into the fog like the legs of enormous spiders, and windows glowed with a sickly green light that seemed to pulse with malevolent light. Little Violet pressed her face against the window, her child's mind somehow better equipped to process the impossible sights than the adults around her. "It's a city," she whispered, "but all the people are asleep. They are lying in the streets, and in the buildings, and they all look like they have been waiting for something. Dr. Blackthorne looked through the window and saw what the child described. The spectral city was populated by thousands of motionless figures, all arranged as if they had simply laid down where they stood and never gotten up again. But as the train passed, these figures began to stir, turning their heads to watch the locomotive with eyes that glowed like dying embers. "They are the missing," Professor Thornfield said from across the aisle, his voice filled with academic fascination despite their dire circumstances. "Every unexplained disappearance in this region for the past 60 years. They are all here." The train began to slow as it approached what appeared to be a massive stone platform carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The architecture was simultaneously ancient and impossibly complex, suggesting builders who understood geometry in ways that human minds couldn't grasp. Tobias Grimm, the traveling salesman who had been silent throughout their supernatural journey, suddenly began to laugh, a sound that carried more despair than humor. "I know why we are here," he said, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I know what they want." She reached into his coat and pulled out a leather portfolio, his hands shaking as he opened it to reveal documents covered in his careful handwriting. "I have been documenting the disappearances for years. Every missing person, every unexplained vanishing, they all had something in common. They had all discovered something they shouldn't have, or they possessed knowledge that threatened to expose the truth about this place." Dr. Blackthorne felt a chill that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold. "What kind of knowledge?" Grimm's laughter grew more manic. "The kind that proves the world isn't what we think it is. The kind that reveals that death isn't the end, but just another beginning. Each of us on this train has stumbled onto pieces of a much larger puzzle." "What happens now?" Judge Ashford demanded, his legal mind still trying to find some rational framework for their situation. "What do you want from us?" The shadow man who had first appeared in the passenger car stepped forward, and now Dr. Blackthorne could see his face clearly. It was the visage of someone who had died violently, flesh hanging in tatters, eyes that were pools of absolute darkness, and a mouth that opened to reveal rows of teeth like broken glass. "What we want," the creature said in a voice like grinding tombstones, "is balance. For decades, the living have trespassed on our domain, disturbing our rest and stealing our secrets. Tonight, we reclaim what was taken, and we add new souls to our rank." The doors of the passenger car began to open by themselves, letting in a rush of air so cold that it seemed to freeze the moisture in their lungs. The spectral figures from outside began to board the train, moving through the aisles like a plague of animated corpses. Blackthorne watched in horror as these beings approached the sleeping passengers. One by one, they placed their ghostly hands on the foreheads of the living, and she could see something, perhaps their souls, perhaps their life essence, being drawn out like smoke from a dying fire. "No," she shouted, standing up and positioning herself between the creatures and little Violet. "Leave the child alone. She's innocent in all of this." The shadow man turned his terrible gaze upon her, and Dr. Blackthorne felt as if she were staring into the abyss of eternity itself. "Innocence is irrelevant, Doctor. The child sees too clearly, understands too much. She would grow up to be dangerous to our kind." But as the creature reached for Violet, something unexpected happened. The little girl stood up, her small frame suddenly radiating a warmth that seemed to push back against the supernatural cold. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed impossible from someone so young. "You cannot take what is protected," Violet said, her eyes glowing with an inner light. "Some of us carry older protections, older contracts." The shadow man recoiled as if burned, and the other spectral figures stopped their advance. Blackthorne stared at the child in amazement, realizing that Violet was far more than she appeared to be. "What are you?" the shadow man hissed, his form wavering like smoke in a strong wind. Violet smiled, and for a moment, she seemed to be not a 7-year-old girl but something ancient and powerful wearing a child's form. "I am what stands between your world and ours. I am the guardian you forgot to fear." The revelation sent shockwaves through the supernatural assembly. Some of the spectral figures began to back away while others pressed forward with renewed hunger, Dr. Blackthorne found herself caught in the middle of a conflict between forces she didn't understand. But she knew that the child beside her represented their only hope of survival. Professor Thornfield, his archaeological mind finally grasping the full scope of what they were witnessing, called out from across the aisle. The symbols in the caves, they weren't just warnings, they were binding contracts. Agreements between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Exactly, Violet said, her young voice carrying centuries of wisdom. And these creatures have violated those agreements by taking the living by force rather than waiting a natural death. The Shadow Man's form began to shift and change, revealing his true nature as something that predated human civilization. The old contracts are void. The barriers weaken with each passing year. We will take what we need to strengthen our realm. But Violet shook her head. The contracts remain binding as long as guardians exist to enforce them, and I am not alone. As if summoned by her words, new figures began to appear on the train, beings of light, rather than shadow, warriors from a realm that existed between life and death. They moved with the same supernatural grace as the dark spirits, but their presence brought warmth instead of cold, hope instead of despair. Dr. Blackthorne watched in amazement as a battle between supernatural forces erupted around them. The train car became a battlefield where concepts of reality held no meaning, where time moved in circles, and where the very air seemed to crack with otherworldly energy. In the midst of this chaos, she realized that their ordeal was far from over. The Shadow Man and his legion of dead souls would not give up easily, and the Guardians of Light seemed to be outnumbered by their dark counterparts. The passengers who remained conscious, herself, Professor Thornfield, Judge Ashford, Tobias Grimm and Little Violet, were caught in the crossfire of a conflict that had been building for decades. As the battle raged around them, the fog outside began to lift, revealing glimpses of a landscape that defied all logic. They were no longer in Pennsylvania, or perhaps anywhere on Earth. The train sat on tracks that stretched across a vast plain dotted with structures that seemed to have been built by alien intelligences, under a sky that showed 3 moons in different phases. Where are we? Dr. Blackthorne asked, though she feared the answer. Violet, still glowing with that inner light as she faced down the shadow creatures, looked back at her with eyes that held far too much knowledge for a child. We are in the crossing place, Dr. Blackthorne, the realm between worlds where all possibilities exist simultaneously, and whether we ever return to our own world depends on the outcome of this battle. The Shadow Man let out a roar that shook the very foundations of reality, and his form expanded till he towered over the train like some impossible nightmare given substance. Around him, the army of the dead began to coalesce into a single, writhing mass of supernatural malevolence. But the Guardians of Light stood firm, with Little Violet at their center, blazing like a star against the encroaching darkness. The final confrontation between the forces of life and death was about to begin, and Dr. Blackthorne realized that the fate of not just the 43 passengers on the Midnight Express, but perhaps all of humanity, hung in the balance. The train that had left Millbrook Junction on that fog-shrouded October night had become the stage for a battle that would determine whether the barriers between worlds would hold, or whether the realm of the dead would finally break through to claim dominion over the living. And in that moment, as supernatural forces clashed around them with the fury of colliding galaxies, Dr. Blackthorne understood that their journey was only just beginning. The battle between light and shadow erupted with a violence that shattered the very concept of reality. Minerva Blackthorne found herself pressed against the train window as supernatural forces clashed around her with the fury of colliding universes. The air itself seemed to scream as the Shadow Man's towering form writhed against the brilliant radiance emanating from Little Violet and her Guardians of Light. But as the conflict raged, Dr. Blackthorne began to notice something that filled her with both hope and terror. Each time the dark forces struck at the Guardians, pieces of the shadow realm began to crack and fall away like a painted facade. Beneath the nightmare landscape of twisted spires and impossible architecture, she caught glimpses of something familiar: rolling Pennsylvania hills, autumn trees, and the faint outline of railroad tracks stretching into a perfectly normal October night. It's an illusion, she breathed, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. This entire realm,
It's not real, it's a construct built from fear and death. Professor Thornfield, still clutching his archaeological journals, looked up from where he had been documenting their supernatural experience. Not an illusion, Doctor, a prison. These entities have been trapped between worlds for so long that they have created their own reality from the fragments of lives they have stolen. Violet turned from her battle with the shadow creatures, her child's face still blazing with that impossible inner light. Professor Thornfield understands part of the truth. This realm exists because the dead refuse to accept their fate, but maintaining it requires constant feeding. Life force stolen from the living. The Shadow Man's roar of rage shook the entire train as more pieces of his constructed reality began to crumble. We will not return to the void. We will not fade into nothing. The living owe us their warmth, their breath, their very existence. Judge Ashford, who had remained silent during much of the supernatural conflict, suddenly stood up with the authority that had served him well in his courtroom. You speak of what's owed, he said, his voice carrying the weight of legal judgment. But what of the debts you have incurred? How many innocent lives have you stolen to maintain your false paradise? The Shadow Man turned his terrible gaze upon the judge, and for a moment, his form shifted to reveal the face of a man Ashford recognized. Jonas Crane, the condemned murderer, whose final words had haunted the judge's nightmare. You sentenced me to death, Horatio Ashford, the creature hissed. But death was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a larger understanding. And now, I offer you the same gift, eternal existence in a realm where justice has no meaning. But Judge Ashford stood firm, his legal mind finally grasping the true nature of their situation. You are not Jonas Crane. You are something that feeds on death, and has taken his form to manipulate me. The real Jonas Crane found peace when he died. You are just an echo, a shadow that refuses to fade. The accuracy of his assessment seemed to wound the creature more than any physical attack could have. The Shadow Man's form began to waver and distort, revealing glimpses of the countless identities he had absorbed over the decades. Miners who had died in cave-ins, travelers who had vanished on lonely roads, children who had wandered too far into the woods and never returned home. Blackthorn watched in fascination as her psychiatric training allowed her to recognize what she was witnessing. You are a collective trauma, she said, her voice filled with both compassion and revulsion. Every violent death, every unresolved grief, every soul that couldn't accept its fate. You have gathered them all together and given them form. The creature's response was a shriek that seemed to come from 1,000 throats at once. We are the forgotten. We are the abandoned. We are those who refuse to be erased from existence. But Violet shook her head, her small form still radiating that protective warmth. You are the lost, and it's time to help you find your way home. What happened next defied every law of physics and logic that Dr. Blackthorn had ever studied. Violet began to glow brighter, but instead of the harsh light of battle, this radiance carried the gentle warmth of a mother's embrace. The light spread outward from her small form, touching each of the shadow creatures that made up the collective entity. And as the light touched them, something miraculous occurred. The twisted, tormented forms began to remember who they had been in life. Dr. Blackthorn saw miners standing tall and proud, their faces free from the anguish of their underground death. She saw children laughing and playing, no longer afraid of the darkness that had claimed them. She saw men and women of all ages, all backgrounds, all walks of life, finally at peace with their mortality. We remember, they whispered in unison, their voices carrying the music of wind through autumn leaves. We remember who we were. We remember that death is not the enemy. Forgetting it, the Shadow Man's towering form began to collapse as the individual souls that comprised him chose to step into Violet's light rather than continue their existence as part of his collective nightmare. With each departure, the false realm around them crumbled further, revealing more and more of the natural world they had left behind. But the creature that had been Jonas Crane, the core of malevolence around which all the other lost souls had gathered, fought against the dissolving of his domain. I will not be forgotten, he screamed, his form now reduced to a writhing mass of pure hatred. I will not let you send us into oblivion. Violet approached the creature with the fearless compassion that only a child could possess. No one is asking you to be forgotten, she said gently. We are asking you to be remembered correctly, not as a monster, but as a man who lost his way. Your victims forgave you long ago. It's time to forgive yourself. The effect of her words was immediate and profound. The shadow that had been Jonas Crane stopped writhing and took on a more human form, that of a middle-aged man whose face was marked by years of pain and regret. For the first time since his transformation, his eyes showed not hatred but the desperate longing of someone who had been lost for far too long. "I can't remember who I was before the anger," he whispered. "I can't remember what it felt like to be human." Violet reached out and placed her small hand on his spectral form. "Then let me help you remember." The light that flowed from her touch carried with it not just warmth, but memories. Images of Jonas Crane as a child, playing in fields of wheat under a summer sun. Memories of his mother singing him to sleep, of his first love, of moments of joy and kindness that had existed long before violence and hatred had consumed his soul. Dr. Blackthorne watched through tears as the man who had become a monster remembered what it meant to be human. The transformation was beautiful and heartbreaking, as decades of accumulated rage and pain fell away like chains being broken. "I remember," Jonas whispered, his form becoming more solid, more real. "I remember the man I used to be. I remember the choices that led me down the dark path. And I remember that those choices were mine to make, not something forced upon me by the world." With that acknowledgement of responsibility came something even more powerful, the possibility of redemption. The false realm around them completed its collapse, revealing the Midnight Express sitting on perfectly normal railroad tracks in the Pennsylvania countryside. The fog had lifted, and the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky with shades of rose and gold. But as reality reasserted itself, Dr. Blackthorne realized that their ordeal was not quite over. The passengers who had fallen into that supernatural sleep during their journey through the shadow realm were beginning to wake up, but many of them showed no memory of what had transpired. To them, it seemed as if they had simply dozed off during a routine train journey, and were now approaching their destination. Only a few retained full awareness of their supernatural experience. Dr. Blackthorne herself, Professor Thornfield, Judge Ashford, Tobias Grimm and little Violet. The others, perhaps mercifully, remembered only fragments, dreamlike images that would fade with time. As the train pulled into Willow Creek Station, their original destination, Dr. Blackthorne found herself questioning whether any of it had really happened. But the evidence was there in the knowing looks exchanged between the few who remembered, in the archaeologist's detailed notes, in the profound change she could see in Judge Ashford's demeanor. And most convincing of all was Violet herself. As the little girl prepared to disembark with her parents, she turned to Dr. Blackthorne with eyes that held their normal childlike innocence, but also a depth of ancient wisdom that would never entirely disappear. "Thank you for protecting me," Violet said simply. "Even when you didn't understand what was happening, you chose to stand between me and the darkness. That kind of courage is what keeps the barriers strong." Dr. Blackthorne knelt down to the child's level. "What happens now? Will those spirits find peace?" Violet smiled, and for just a moment, that inner light flickered behind her eyes. "They are already at peace. The realm they created is dissolving, and they are free to move on to whatever comes next. The crossing is closed. And you, what are you really?" The little girl considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm what I have always been, a child who sees things others can't. But I'm also something more, something that exists to maintain the balance between worlds. There are others like me scattered throughout time and space, making sure that the living and the dead remain in their proper realms." As Violet walked away with her parents, Dr. Blackthorne noticed that Judge Ashford had overheard their conversation. The stern jurist approached her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, humility mixed with profound gratitude. "Doctor," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something. What we experienced tonight, do you believe it was real?" She considered her answer carefully. "I believe that reality is far more complex than we usually acknowledge. Whether what we experienced was literal or metaphorical, it changed us, and sometimes that's the most important kind of truth there is." Professor Thornfield joined their conversation, his journal tucked securely under his arm. "I have been documenting everything I can remember," he said. "The symbols, the architecture, the supernatural physics of that other realm. Whether anyone believes our account or not, the record needs to exist." Tobias Grimm, who had been strangely quiet since their return to normal reality, finally spoke up. "The documents I carry," he said, referring to the portfolio of secrets he had been using for blackmail. "I think it's time to destroy them. Some knowledge is too dangerous to exist, and some secrets are better left buried." As the passengers dispersed into the dawn light, each going their separate ways, Dr. Blackthorne found herself alone on the platform with her thoughts. The Midnight Express had continued on its route toward Chicago, carrying no evidence of the supernatural journey it had completed. To the railroad authorities, to the newspapers, to anyone who cared to investigate, it had been a routine trip that had arrived slightly behind schedule due to fog. But Dr. Blackthorne knew better. She had witnessed something that challenged every assumption about the nature of life, death, and the spaces in between. More importantly, she had seen the power of compassion to transform even the darkest evil into something capable of redemption. Over the following months, she would incorporate these experiences into her psychiatric practice, developing new approaches to helping patients deal with trauma and loss. Her theories about the connection between the living and the dead would revolutionize the field of psychology, though she would never reveal the true source of her insights. Professor Thornfield would return to his archaeological work with a new understanding of the sites he studied. His published papers would speak cautiously of cultural metaphors and symbolic representations, but his private journals would preserve the truth of what they had experienced. Judge Ashford would become known for his compassionate approach to criminal justice, always seeking to understand the human story behind even the most heinous crime. His sentencing would focus on rehabilitation rather than pure punishment, as if he had learned that even the most lost souls could find their way back to humanity. And little Violet would grow up to become exactly what she appeared to be, a normal child who happened to see the world with unusual clarity and compassion. But those who knew her would always sense that there was something special about her, something that made them feel safer in her presence. As for the Midnight Express itself, it would continue to run its route for another 20 years before being retired. But railroad workers would sometimes report strange incidents on foggy nights, glimpses of spectral passengers in the windows, the sound of phantom footsteps in empty cars, and an occasional feeling that the train was carrying more souls than could be accounted for by the passenger manifest. Dr. Blackthorne would keep the secret of that October night for the rest of her life, sharing the full truth only in a sealed letter that she instructed be opened 50 years after her death. That letter, when finally discovered, would provide the first comprehensive account of what really happened to the 43 passengers who boarded the Midnight Express on October 13. But even that account would raise more questions than it answered. Investigators would find that several of the passengers had indeed been involved in unusual circumstances. Judge Ashford's controversial trial, Professor Thornfield's archaeological discoveries, Dr. Blackthorne's pioneering research into the connection between life and death. The patterns were too precise to be coincidental, yet too strange to be easily explained. The official records would show that the train had arrived at its destination with all passengers accounted for and no incidents reported. But those who looked deeper would find small anomalies. A conductor's report of unusual weather conditions, an engineer's notation about mechanical irregularities that corrected themselves, and several passenger testimonials describing vivid dreams during the journey. In the end, the mystery of the Midnight Express would join the ranks of America's greatest unsolved cases. Paranormal investigators would cite it as evidence of supernatural intervention in human affairs. Skeptics would dismiss it as mass hysteria combined with historical embellishment. But those who had lived through it would carry the truth in their hearts, that on one fog-shrouded October night in 1903, a train full of passengers had journeyed to the very edge of eternity and returned with the knowledge that death was not the end, but merely another beginning. The train that left Millbrook Junction on that mysterious night had indeed vanished without a trace, not because it had met with disaster, but because it had traveled to a place beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. And while the passengers had returned to their own world, they had left something behind in that realm between life and death: their fear of the unknown, their certainty about the nature of existence, and their belief that some mysteries could never be solved. They had learned that some journeys transform not just where you go but who you are when you arrive, and sometimes the most important destinations are the ones that exist only when you are brave enough to step off the map of the known world and venture into the fog of infinite possibility. The Midnight Express had completed its most important journey that night, not across the landscape of Pennsylvania, but across the landscape of the human soul. And in doing so it had proved that even in the darkest fog, Even when all seems lost, there is always a light to guide travelers safely home. The mystery would endure as the best mysteries always do, not because it couldn't be solved, but because its solution required a kind of courage that few possessed, the courage to believe that the impossible might sometimes be the most important truth of all.